Hey guys, Cybertail back with you. All things chess with Cybertail, that's me. First off, got a cool new wrestling shirt. Kenny Omega when he was with New Japan Pro Wrestling. Anyways, we're going to continue our examination of isolated queen pawns. Today's going to be sort of a one-off because it'll cover sort of a smaller concept in that when it's appropriate to transition to a symmetrical structure. By that I mean each side having an isolated pawn. And that would be where the side that doesn't have the isolated pawn trades off a piece in front of the isolated pawn. So just so we're absolutely clear on what I mean by that, so it's not opaque. In this position, something like this, where you have a situation where each side has an isolated pawn, and the pawn structure is symmetrical. This is a smaller topic because it doesn't come up nearly as often, but it is important to take a look at. Also, I promised that we would take a look at a fairly classic game in my last session, so this would be that classic game. This is the game Botvinnik-Alekhine from the AVRO tournament in 1938. Botvinnik started off with knight f3. Just one of many ways to get an isolated pawn. Also an important move order if you're trying to maneuver your way into a certain English opening or a d4 opening. Perfectly fine move. The only downside is it potentially commits you to a system against the King's Indian that you might not care for, but you'll have that worked out beforehand if you're playing knight f3. d5. d4, just an aside, c4 would be the original version of the ready opening. This was a huge revelation back in the 10s and 20s, but now it's just assumed that you have the hypermodern playbook on board when you're playing. The idea of attacking the center with pawns instead of occupying it with attacking the center with pieces instead of occupying it with pawns. It's just assumed you have that on board now. But d4 is classical and normal. Knight f6 or e6. Knight c3. g3 would be the Catalan Opening, and this is very much a modern phenomenon. This has really only caught on in the past, let's say, 40 years, which in terms of chess is a fairly recent phenomenon. But this game was played back in 1938, so at that point the Catalan was just sort of a hypermodern glint in the eye of people playing things. But knight c3 was just the normal tableau for that time. c5, this commits us to a Tarrasch or a semi-Tarrasch. Bishop e7, bishop g5, that would be the standard Queen's Gambit declined. This was the scourge of the chess scene, especially in the 1920s. The Capablanca-Alekhine match in 1927, I think all but 2 games were Queen's Gambit declines. It might have even been all but 1. Alekhine won the first game, which was a French, e46. And then I think from then on out, it might have been all Queen's Gambit declines. But when they started talking about the draw death of chess back in the 20s, one main reason was that they played so many Queen's Gambit declines, and they got so much analysis of what they thought was the correct moves. So the hypermodern revolution of the 20s, where not every game had to begin with e4. d4 sort of freshened chess back up and took analysis in new directions, which was badly needed. But c5, a bit more interesting, takes it towards a Tarrasch or a semi-Tarrasch. Knight takes. ed would be the full Tarrasch. This has got a lot of interesting analysis in modern chess. It's actually a perfectly good opening. A lot of the opening theory is starting to get very large and very complex, so it is becoming a much more of a specialist opening. But it's a perfectly good opening. If you want to give something different a try, if you like playing with an isolated pawn, give this a try as black. You'll be absolutely pleased with it. But knight d5 avoids the isolated pawn for black. And then e3. Botvinnik was really one of the first modern players to really evaluate the isolated queen pawn correctly. Before Botvinnik, Wilhelm Steinitz came along, and he formulated basic positional principles. He was really the first world champion to do that. Amongst those was that you should avoid pawn weaknesses. So until Botvinnik in the Soviet chess school, the isolated queen pawn was sort of looked at suspiciously, like it was a weakness not worth having. It wasn't but Botvinnik came along and completely reevaluated everything. He looked at the attacks and activity that white gained. And here, part of the series, we will look at more of Botvinnik's games, because his games are such a foundational part of evaluating the isolated queen pawn correctly. But e3 goes for the isolated pawn. e4 would be a way to avoid it. This would be the mainline semi-tirage. This used to be considered critical for white, but as far as I can see, modern theory is mostly defanged this. This really isn't interesting anymore. In top-level chess, pretty much all the drawing methods are quite well known for black here. So e3 keeps a lot more life in the position because it goes for that interesting isolated queen-pawn dynamic. Knight c6. Bishop c4. This is the move order that I personally prefer because it puts immediate pressure on the d5 outpost square. As I've said in a couple other videos, bishop d3 is perfectly fine. It's just another chess move. But bishop c4 is my own personal preference. cd, ed, bishop e7, and rook e1. So this is just the standard isolated queen pawn tabia. And now black needs to decide what to do here. Just a refresher, we've looked at this in other videos before. Bishop f6, in my opinion, is the correct path for black. Knight f6 is sort of a waste of tempo, in my opinion. And then there's the move in the game, which is b6. If white didn't have the move that he plays in the game, this would be a perfectly good move. But that's not the way chess works. So b6 plans to develop the bishop to b7, and this is a move that's still played quite a bit frequently today, but it is just a basic positional error, because white takes on d5. And this is the perfect time to transition to a symmetrical structure, because b6 plans to develop the dark square bishop to b7. If black chooses to do that now that bishop will be biting on the granite of his own pawn on d5. And if black chooses to develop the bishop somewhere else, he could do that, but it would also leave the light squares on the queen side completely weak. So knight d5 is the right timing for that, because b6 is poor timing for black. One line I give, if white didn't have access to knight d5, if he played something like bishop b3, this would be just a normal position. You know, it's not bad for white, but black has an excellent game here. This is just a normal hanging pawns position. But the position in the game, Botvinnik very precisely crushes all of Alekhine's attempts to break free. So bishop e5. This is an excellent example of tempo play. If you give black one free move, suddenly the game's back to being completely equal. Botvinnik had an excellent feel for tempo play, for moving with a threat each move and keeping the other side from developing his own position. Bishop e5 does just that. And this puts black in an uncomfortable situation. If he chooses bishop b7, which isn't what he chose in the game, but if he chooses bishop b7, as I mentioned earlier, that bishop is going to be biting on the granite of that d5 pawn, and that's going to be an extraordinarily passive piece. If he plays bishop d7, which is what he chose in the game, suddenly the squares on the light squares on the queen side are a little bit weak. So each side has a concrete drawback. In the game, Alekhine chose bishop d7, queen a4, and this is more tempo play, hitting the knight on c6 more and developing it even further. Knight b8. If black tries to defend that, black just continues to develop. One of the striking things about this game, at least to me, is how Botvinnik's threats develop solely because he just continues to develop his pieces. When you look at the games of the truly great players, in virtually every game, they just mobilize constantly. They never let their pieces sit around in the back rank and gather dust. They're always moving their pieces into the fight, and that's a good lesson for all of us. You need to develop your pieces as quickly as you can. You need to mobilize as quickly as you can. So in rook c8, bishop f4 is completely appropriate because it prepares just simply rook a c1, which further attacks down the c-file. Bishop f6. And here, rook e c1 is a little bit better than rook a c1, but both are perfectly fine. This is an overwhelming position for white. He has just a huge amount of piece activity. In a symmetrical structure like this, piece activity is all that matters, because neither side really has a pawn break. The only thing that matters is how many pieces you have developed and how active those pieces are. So Botvinnik chooses wisely in getting mobilized as quickly as possible. So knight b8 and bishop f4. He does the same thing. He just continues to mobilize and develop. Very strong play. Bishop takes. E6. Queen a4. This is maybe white's first slight error. Queen d3 is a little bit more accurate. Keeps the queen centralized. And on black playing b5, he'll have the immediate a4 resource, which hits that pawn on b5. But just a small detail. Bishop d6. Trades off. Then rook ac1. When you look at the games of the great players, they're also not afraid to go into endings. Botvinnik isn't afraid to go into an ending here, because he knows all the fundamentals favor him. He controls both open files. Both the C and the E file are open files. He controls both those with his rooks. Black has gone backwards in development. He only has his queen developed now, whereas white's completely mobilized. So all the fundamentals of the position are in white's favor, so he's not afraid to transition to an ending, because that sort of only amplifies his advantage. Let's say if we took the 2 queens off the board, then that was black's only developed piece, and suddenly white can just penetrate to the 7th rank and dominate the position. Strong players aren't afraid to go into endings, because they know that some advantages fully translate to an ending, and they're not afraid to take it there and convert that advantage. Rook a7, good play, defends the 7th rank. Queen c2, that prevents rook c7, challenging for the c file. Rook e7, so he challenges for the c file. And again, he trades it off. He's not afraid to go in an ending here, because he knows that he's keeping his advantage going into the endgame. Queen takes. And this is a good endgame to look at your own study. It's sort of away from the isolated queen pawn study that we're doing, but I'll give some other notes from this point. This is a dominating ending for white, even though the pawn structure is completely symmetrical. That rook on c7 is incredibly strong. The knight on f3 is much stronger than the knight on b8. This is a dominating position for white, and it's instructive to see how Botvinnik he converts that activity into a concrete plus. f6. This is good defensive chess. He's covering the e5 and the g5 squares. King f1. When you're in an endgame, one of the main things that's different than the opening or middle game is that your king has to become a fighting piece. Once you've reached an endgame, it is crucial to develop your king. You need to get your king involved in the game. So don't let your king just sit on the back rank once you reach an ending. King f1 starts the process of mobilizing white's king. Rook f7, challenging for the 7th rank. Rook c8 just moves the rook back. Black would be very glad with a draw here. So on rook c7, black would be very glad to play rook f7. Rook c3, the rooks just avoids the perpetual, but it's keeping on the strong c file, so white hasn't lost its advantage. g5, not the best. When you're defending, you want to try to avoid creating weaknesses, and g5 just sort of creates a target on the king side for attack. He really should have held tight with something more like a5. But g5, knight e1, not the best. h4 immediately challenging. That sore thumb in g5 is probably best. And something like this. Suddenly this 7th rank is completely cleared, so a white rook coming to c7 is even more powerful. Plus the pawn on h6 is a weakness here. But knight e1 is perfectly fine as well. h5, and then h4. This is good endgame play from Botvinnik. He's challenging those potential weaknesses on the king side. So if black if black decides to take on h4, suddenly all his pawns on the king side are weak and isolated. If he plays g4, suddenly that creates an outpost square for the knight, so the knight can play knight d3, then it's headed for the f4 square where it hits both those pawns in d5 and h5. So h4, excellent attacking play. Knight d7, this is weak. Black should be mobilizing his king. Black is still much worse, but it would at least give him a fighting chance. No matter what sort of endgame you're in, you need to mobilize your king. You can't just leave it sitting in the back rank. But knight d7, rook c7 back to the 7th rank, knight f3, g4, and then just back to knight e1. And now that knight's ready to go to d3, and then f4, where it hits those weak pawns. So f5, knight d3, f4 occupies the f4 square, but it leaves those pawns even more weak. So f3 blockades the pawn, and now that's a weakness that black has to protect. G takes. Simple chess, just immobilizes the pawns on the queen side. Now every single one of black's pawns is a sitting duck. and it's eligible for attack by white's much more active rook. F8, c6. B3, this is a good example of how strong players don't rush. B4 is much more direct and possibly stronger. But when you look at the games of the great players like Botvinnik, one thing that strikes you is that they don't rush. They don't go into an endgame and suddenly start messing around playing too abruptly. When you have an advantage like this, basically white's position is completely dominating. None of black's weak pawns are going anywhere. Black's not able to mobilize. Black's not able to activate his pieces. There's no point in rushing. So you might as well just take your time, look at the position, play in 2 moves what you could do in 1, and just see what happens in the position. There's no reason to rush here because all of white's advantages are completely permanent. There's no reason to get flustered and do something sudden. King d8, rook g6. Rook h6 is a bit more direct, but it's also perfectly fine. King c7, and then the rook decisively penetrates. Knight c6, and then this is gone. I'll leave the rest of the moves for everyone to look at in the PGN file that I'll include in the comments as usual. I really just wanted to mainly look at the initial opening choice. That choice to transition to a symmetrical structure. Basically, the key that you're looking for if you have an opportunity to transition to a symmetrical structure, in isolated queen pawns or really any structure, one of the few things that really matters is in a symmetrical structure is piece activity and piece mobilization. Because when the pawn structure is completely symmetrical, there's no imbalances to take advantage of. Each side's pawns are just on the same sides. There's no imbalances in that respect. It's important to have as many active pieces as possible and to have as many pieces out as possible. So if you have a big edge in development and your pieces are much more active, you can consider transitioning to a symmetrical structure like this because your advantage in piece activity is going to be overwhelming. So in this situation, Botvinnik transitioned because he saw that he had better mobilized pieces, and he saw that momentary weakness with b6 allowed him to take the initiative with bishop b5 and then queen a4. And that initiative grew and grew because he was able to mobilize more of his pieces and get a huge edge in initiative. So, quick game. I just wanted to look over the basic concept. Next video, we're going to be continuing with isolated pawns. We're going to be looking at more complex kingside attacks and how white tends to operate once black has stopped d5 from happening. So, my name is Silertail, also John, and I will speak with you later.